think tank has moved on somewhat, right? And you need to have a wider spectrum of influencing tools beyond just the publication of research outputs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our podcast. My guest today is Laurie Laybourn from the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. And with him today, we're going to discuss how they managed to use podcasts as a way to give a voice and create an impact for their research. Laurie, I'm very happy to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Well, as we mentioned, you guys really managed to nail something that a lot of knowledge initiatives and think tanks are looking into. How can they make their research more appealing for a wider audience? But before we dive into that, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you guys do?
Happily. So, as you say, I run a think and do tank, as we call it, called the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative. And we're basically focused on the next chapter of the climate crisis. So the world is going over 1.5 degree temperature rise. This is the level that in 2015, governments around the world identified as where climate change should be capped, basically. We're now going over that, unfortunately, and it is creating a much more volatile world, and that is going to get worse. But it doesn't mean the game is up. It just means the context for climate action is going to be that much more challenging. So we as an initiative focus on a range of things to help various institutions, governments and private firms and so on to better understand that world. So we do a lot of risk assessment and work on conceptualizing the risks that we're increasingly facing. And then we go one step further to help a wider audience understand that through things like podcasts and storytelling. And then we also do things like scenario exercises and sort of war games. We call them resilience games, which just, as you say, go beyond that focus primarily, traditionally, that think tanks have on the production of research outputs, often, as you say, PDFs, and the promotion of those.
Cool. And can I ask you, how did the whole idea started for throughThe? Were you the founder of it?
Yes, I'm the founder. And it started from my generational frustration, if I can put it like that. So when I was in my 20s, I was working in other think tanks in the context of policy. And I was, on one hand, very bullish about the idea that we would be able to deliver the scale of climate action needed to avoid the very worst cases. But on the other hand, I was acutely aware that as someone in the so-called millennial generation, I had many, many decades of my career in front of me. To put that another way, many nations have signed up to the idea of largely getting rid of their carbon emissions by the year 2050. Now, I'm due, apparently, according to the UK government, the country where I'm based, to retire well after 2050. So basically, reaching our climate goals is something that happens in a subset of my career, let alone my life. And I was becoming very frustrated that there weren't enough people talking about how we could deliver the climate action needed over that time, while also dealing with the increasingly severe impacts of climate change back on us. And my concern was that as those consequences of climate change got worse, it could actually undermine our climate agency, because we would be handling those disasters, they would be causing all sorts of chaotic political consequences, and all of those things and more could get in the way of our ability to deliver climate action, which means we would be in serious trouble. So we made the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative as an institute that focuses on those kind of questions. Basically, how do we navigate a climate changed world so that we are able to ultimately exit that world, or at least enter some kind of climate restabilization over that period?
Yeah, I got it. And how old is this, the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative?
So we are now about 3 to 4 years old. So we're relatively new. We were born out of other think tanks as well, including being accelerated by a think tank that I've had an association for a while called Chatham House, based here in the UK.
Yeah, very famous one. Would you like to share with us some of the main important milestones that you guys have reached throughout this few years?
So some highlights include us relatively early on. We delivered a trial version of a mid-career leadership development program. We called it Cohort 2040. And this very much was exercising the ethos that I described earlier. We were there trying to provide people who were roughly in their 30s with some support such that they could be better equipped to handle the worsening consequences of climate change into the future. And the idea behind that basically was that the average age of someone on Earth, I think, is somewhere around 32. And that happens to be half the average age of world leaders, which is about 64, I think. And so a certain generation, that millennial generation, has to live their lives again, potentially, before that whole generation is leading everywhere. And that would be as we headed through the 20s. So we did a very successful trial program. We learned a lot. There's lots more that we'd like to do on the front. Some other highlights include developing what we think were one of the first efforts to develop a scenario exercise of a climate tipping point. These are moments where bits of the climate could abruptly change. We played that in 2023 with a number of people, including in the context of some governments. And then closer to now, last year, a particular highlight of ours was releasing a major podcast documentary. It's called Overshoot, Navigating a World Above 1.5 Degrees. And we were delighted that ended up getting in the top 2% most shared podcast globally on Spotify. And we reached a lot of people with what was basically our story of what is coming next and how we might navigate that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good moment now to kind of latch on to the main topic of the podcast, which is actually your podcast. And yeah, you said it very well. So your podcast was extremely successful. Not only was in top 2% of the most shared podcast, but I saw it also had massive media coverage in UK and in the rest of the world. I know that there's a lot of like research initiatives and think tanks that are thinking of like adding initiatives like this. So for example, podcasts or other channels like, for example, YouTube to their communication. I would like you to kind of guide us through what were the choices that made you realize we need something like this. Some of the question marks you had at the beginning, and also how you managed to make it happen and turn it into success.
So great questions. The thing that stimulated us to do it was that we were understanding that the people that we wanted to work with on this big question of how we can actually navigate what climate change throws at us next, right? This is a world in which, we're talking right now in the throes of the crisis in the Middle East, and that crisis is going to lead to higher energy prices, probably much higher inflation in food, more geopolitical instability and uncertainty. These kind of things, what we're living through now and probably increasingly in the coming months, they are similar to the dynamics that climate change will bring into the future. And we really want to work out how we can better navigate those conditions. But we have often found through our work that others weren't quite at the point of realization that world is now, some version of that is now guaranteed. So that led us to the point where we thought, well, we need to step up our storytelling to get other people to start to ask the questions that we're asking, so that we can then work with them on the answers to those questions. And we thought, well, how do we do that? And the traditional answer, as you've said so far in our conversation, is that you publish reports where you set that out in quite some detail. And we thought, well, we could be a bit more creative than that. And maybe that isn't the best way. What is the kind of product that people consume these days when it comes to that storytelling? And there are a number of answers to that question. And one of them includes some kind of narrative podcast, right? So Overshoot is not the usual interview form podcast with many episodes stretching into the future where we bring on a new guest every week. We talk to them like we're doing today. This is a scripted podcast, like a documentary you watch on Netflix, but just audio, right?
It's a very complex series. I think 6 or 7 episodes, something like that.
It's like a core of 4. And then we did some live stuff as well when we launched it, right? And so we thought this is a particularly good format, and some of the audiences that we wanted to get to, particularly in, say, the context of civil society, some of the funders of climate work, we thought it would be very easy for them to listen to this on 2 times speed while they're going about their business. So that's what sort of led us to identify this. Other things that helped us identify it as an area to pursue was that we just knew lots of people and stories that we thought we could wed together into an overall narrative. This was crucial, right? It's one thing to realize that this is a good way to get your story out. It's another thing entirely for you to actually have the capabilities that means you could execute it. And we did.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the technical capabilities, and we ended up working with a independent production agency who provided us with that editorial and technical support, right? And then we just went forth and we began to knit together the stories that we thought were particularly important. And we interviewed lots and lots of people. And we did basically what happens whenever you make a documentary, which is you probably spend hundreds of hours, and I'm not joking, for every 30 minutes of content that's produced. So we interviewed upwards of 70 people. There were half that featured on the podcast. We've got hundreds of hours of recording, and we whittled down and down and down and down. We had expert reviewers. We had people who were similar to the audiences we wanted to reach, who were providing that sort of audience review as well. And it took us about a year, and we ended up publishing it last October. So really the whole purpose here was to do some of this big storytelling in a format that people are used to hearing stories on and want to hear stories on, so that we could then get people to the point where they're asking similar questions to us.
Got it. And it also sounds from what you're saying is that you decided to go for the approach of like high quality, perhaps a bit slower in terms of production and also higher costs, but really crafting something which looks like a very high quality product versus podcasts that are a little bit more high frequency, for example, and are also easier to record. Like there's a lot of podcasts where people just turn the camera on. Like this is one of those, for example, where actually editing and post-production is not necessarily that complicated. So I was actually curious, like my question would have been, if you say, looking at it ex post, is it harder or easier than what you managed before starting?
It's hard. It's very hard. Because of they're very hard because of the sheer scale of time. And you've got to, so yeah, why is it hard? There are a number of dimensions. One is time, right? Which equals resource, because you're having to fund the time of the people who are participating in it, right? And it does require a lot of time. It is, as you say, much harder to produce 30 minutes of content on a narrative podcast than an interview podcast like we're doing today. But you get that coherence of story and depth, right? If interview podcasts are very good at exploring one perspective or mapping the broad contours of an issue, and I think they are very good at those things. With a narrative podcast, you can both go deeper and you can establish a story that might stick with people into the future. I think you've got more opportunity to do that, right? An example of this for us is establishing the core image that we wanted people to keep in their minds going forward. And let me share that with you quickly. So often we tell stories about the climate crisis with the same image as, say, a ship facing a storm on the horizon, right? And the ship represents the world, the storm represents the climate crisis. And in that model, as it were, the job of the climate aware is to get other crew members on the ship to face up to the existence of this storm that's sitting there over on the horizon, and then to get everyone to work together to change the course, and then ultimately we'd sail around and all be well. And that's how we've talked about climate change now for decades. The problem is that societies didn't face up, not everyone in society faced up to the existence of the hypothetical and literal storm of the climate crisis. And we didn't change the bearing enough for societies. We didn't move away from fossil fuels fast enough. And now we are in the literal and figurative storm of a global climate crisis. And when that happens, your strategy has to shift. Your strategy as a sailor, when you're sailing towards a storm, is largely to spot it and then to change direction, and then it would be fine. When you're in it, your strategy then explodes in its complexity. You have to have better situational awareness, so you know what's around you and you need to avoid and might still hit you and brace yourself for it. You need to have a more robust ship. You need to make sure that the crew's morale is focused. The list goes on. And it's one thing for me to explain that core image to you right now in an interview podcast. It's another thing to have that drilled into people's minds over the course of a few episodes that are rich with storytelling. And so what we have found is that I guess we could characterize that as the stickiness of our narrative. There's a higher chance that there's a greater stickiness potentially because of that depth we can go into with that storyline.
What's beautiful about your podcast is that it's really crafted almost as a documentary. and where there is the narrating voice, but also like interviews from people like in short frames, which again, it's something that I imagine costs quite some time in terms of post production. What I was curious of is like, well, the podcast was massively successful, right? What do you think contributed to the success of the podcast?
I think so. I think there are a few dimensions. One is we produced a high quality product, right?
And can I just, where do you see, like when you talk about quality, is like technical quality, is the narrative arc, like
So I hope that we ticked most of those potential dimensions, right? So yes, from a technical perspective, we have just brilliant mixing. We've got soundscapes in there. It is much easier now to interview people around the world. We're doing it on Riverside. We use Riverside as well. And in many cases, it was better for us to do an online recording through Riverside than to go physically to a location and record people with mics, often because we could mess that up. Whereas Riverside, and I'm doing this on an Apple computer today, it's probably high quality. Also, there is now, I think, as a listener, particularly after COVID, the bar of quality of audio has lowered somewhat. We're used now to different microphone quality types, whereas before, I think for like a marquee documentary, you needed the kind of best in class microphone equipment that you would hear, say, on the BBC or something like that. Whereas now we're much used to a different set of audio quality. We still have very high audio quality, but I think it's become easier to craft that product basically as an actual technical listening experience. We also, I think, we really invested in the storyline construction. So we went through multiple rounds of initial treatments, so sort of mini essays and stories of what we wanted to say, like you would do for a film. And then we interviewed, probably, I don't know, 50% more people than we thought we were. We had entire storylines that then were ditched. We then made sure that we were going for the top people in the field, right? An example of this is that we had an episode that looked at the dodgy economics that is used to assess climate risks by pension funds and other really important firms. This is a big scandal, I think. And we had a mixture of really sort of human stories to help us understand what is quite a technical area. So we interviewed an amazing pensioner in the north of England who had worked out that her pension fund just thought that climate change was not going to be that bad, and that was putting her pension at risk. But we supplemented that with having an interview with Joseph Stiglitz, who is one of the best top economists in the world, used to advise US presidents and has won a Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics. So we made sure we had that sort of caliber of human interest storyline to then complement the caliber of expert and so on that we then spoke to. And then as a last dimension of quality as well, we made sure that we were exploiting our networks within various domains that would find this interesting, including sending this around to various journalists and so on so that they could see it. And we ended up getting a decent amount of media attention, ranging from The Guardian in the context of the UK all the way through to Bloomberg News.
Yeah, that's also another point that I would like to ask you about, because like so far we talked more about the product quality of what you guys produce, and I'm also interested, this being a podcast about also marketing and communication, I'm also interested on like what was the communication strategy once you released the podcast. You said we ended up, how do you get from publishing to then be featured by these important newspapers?
So it's a great question. And we had constrained resources. We also, I was going to say, we made the mistake of not putting enough of our resources into promotion. It's not a mistake we made, because we had such a constrained pot of resources that they were all used up by the time for story construction, for basically the creation of the product, right? And best practice is that the vast majority of resources should be on promotion and the minority on the actual product creation itself. And we had such a constrained pot that I think that we had to use, we basically had the resources to do the product to the level we wanted and then not enough for promotion. So if we were doing it differently, I think, just to go on this tangent slightly, we might have been able to dial down elements of the quality, so we had some more resource for promotion, but I'm not sure we wanted to do that because there was a sufficient level of quality that we wanted to go through. I think the lesson really is either to make sure that if you're getting external resourcing for this, you really focus on ensuring that additional resources given for promotion above and beyond the reaching a sufficient level of quality of the products. If you can't find the resources, if often is the case, then developing an idea of what your more organic, bootstrapped promotion capability will be is something you need to do from the beginning, because it means that you can direct the production of the product in such a way that you're always thinking about that promotion. We didn't do that enough, but what we did do was identify some of our interviewees and our storylines, particularly the human interest ones, knowing that they are underserved subjects and knowing that they might be of interest to journalists down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And we did get a situation where we had press interest in interviewing some of our interviewees because their stories were really interesting. And then there were press stories about that, which, were not promotional products. This was additional journalism kind of sitting on top of what we were doing. But basically we were producing content we knew could be newsworthy, knowing that we would then indirectly benefit from that down the line.
That's a very good angle. That's very interesting. So it was mainly a PR strategy or something, a PR-led initiative that helped you then support the outreach that you then had with journalists.
Yeah, exactly. We basically were like, we can make this as interesting as we think we can. We basically have the scope within the creation of the product to make this more interesting for people who might indirectly effectively promote what we're doing, right? We didn't have the budget to seek that kind of PR capacity with news outlets and so on and so on. But so we thought, well, what we could box smart here by producing content of sufficient quality that actually it might be newsworthy, and that definitely works. And then we did some of the usual things for promotion. We had a very, very, very small ads budget, which didn't go far at all. And we also got a lot of very supportive quotes from lots of high-profile people who we know our audiences would find interesting, from leading environmental commentators, politicians, former heads of the IPCC, this kind of stuff. Brian Eno very kindly gave us a quote. And so, through that was the classic usual strategy of that attracting people, but also getting those people to then talk about it on social media. And we just made sure that we were also putting our content on YouTube. This is not often sometimes people are not using it. And my understanding is that YouTube is one of, if not the biggest podcast platform globally. And we found that we've had way more uptake on YouTube as you would expect.
The second most used search engine platform. And
Right.
Laurie, try to wearing now the hat of another think tank director, or do a think tank director who's also potentially interested in launching a podcast. I'm curious if you can dissect for me, like, what were the initiatives that moved the needle more when it came to the communication and outreach that you did after your podcast, and what would have you done differently or more if you had more budget, more resources?
I mean, on the latter question, we would have just pumped that into promotion. We would have done more events, probably some more ads. We probably would have done more events, to be honest. More live episodes, right? More recorded. We did one episode. We partnered with Freud's group in the UK, and we did what was effectively a live launch episode with a panel. We might do some more of those in the future, but we would have done more of those, and more like a proper ad strategy. But then we also, we got to think, like, why did we do the podcast, right? And sure, part of it is reaching into the public discourse and getting in front of as many people as possible. But more, we were doing it because we wanted to make an intervention into a sort of subset of the discourse about climate change, which is the discourse that is happening in what you could describe as the climate policy nexus. So, there are groups of people who are professionalized, they work in NGOs, they work in funding organizations, the list goes on. And this was an intervention that understood that group was in some ways struggling to know what their story was going to be about this big moment, which is that we're going over 1.5 degrees. And it was an intervention to try and influence some of that discussion, basically. And so our promotion strategy would never be the kind of marquee large-scale ad strategy where you're basically spending, for every $1 spend on the product, you're spending 9 on promotion. Instead, we're much more targeted, and that would mean that we wouldn't require so many resources for that kind of promotion strategy. So we would use those resources wisely to get really to our first order audience, which of course is partly influenced by the second order audience, which is the sort of wider public discussion and so on and so forth. Which goes a bit to my answer to your first question, which is that as a think and do tank, we are partly that, i.e. we do research and we apply that research through more engaging tools, particularly scenario experiences, because we think that that's just the nature of how you actually have impact now in the world with policy. The world in which you could have just a think tank has moved on somewhat, right? And you need to have a wider spectrum of influencing tools beyond just the publication of research outputs and the promotion of those through media. So we're talking here about getting much more in front of decision makers, playing around not just in closing their knowledge gaps, but actually beginning to engage their action gaps, the way they conceive of what they can do in the world. And the list goes on. So for us, this is less about like an interesting novel product that we produced that still sits very much within what I think we could describe as the information deficit theory of change of think tanks, of, people just need the information and the world will change. More, this is part of what we see as a whole spectrum of products that you deploy at various points along the way of changing the very story that people have in their minds. And that might include a report and or a documentary and or events and or media releases and or war game exercises, and the list goes on. So instead of a project being like something where you deliver a report at the end, a very linear way of thinking about the think tank, our model is different. It's more about the outcomes you want and then the different products that pop up along the way. That's how we conceive of a project.
That's a very interesting angle. Traditional think tanks kind of ended their activity with the production of a report, whereas what you're saying is that actually that's only half of the story now. What think tanks now need to get in front of decision makers and then also trigger actions. And I think it's a very interesting insight. How are you guys trying to do that? So you mentioned that you have multiple initiatives, multiple products when it comes to that. Anything particular that comes to mind when it comes to triggering action?
So it depends which area we're looking at. So we have different strategic objectives like any think tank would have. One of the main ones is to basically rehearse the future. The future is going to look very different to the way the past has played out when it comes to climate. Our journey from here to there is going to be a non-linear journey. It's going to feel a bit like a slower motion version of the early stages of COVID, where we experienced exponential change. And many institutions they are geared for what the world has been like so far. So one of our strategic objectives is kind of rehearse what that future might look like and to develop certain general capabilities for handling that future. And what that means is that, instead, we don't necessarily think of that from a project perspective. We think of that as an overall purpose of what we're doing. And then we think of a journey that we want to take certain stakeholders on, and different products appear along that way, right? So I guess you could broadly map something like the Overshoot podcast as one of the products to deploy earlier on, something that people listen to, they begin to think, oh, wow, it opens their mind about what the future could look like. Then we deploy, say, a scenario exercise of one of the types of events that could happen in that future that is characteristic of the dynamics that we could see. Rapid change, multiple parts of our societies being destabilized at the same time, that interacting with other problems that are happening like wars or whatever. So deploying that next, what it does is it takes understanding to the next level, but it goes beyond just supporting understanding in a way that, not going to get from just reading something, from actually playing it, you'll understand it more. But the conversation is then moved on to what capabilities are needed. And then as we go through this sort of chain of impact, we could deploy a report. might be useful to have one, because in that report, it could be full with ideas about something that this given institution like a government could do. Here's a list that we thought of, guys, of how you could respond to the types of things that you just gameplayed. And then as we head further along this sort of chain of impact, we could include things like networking and community building, so that people in the institution we've been focused on are connected to those in other institutions who are grappling with similar problems, but from a different sectoral perspective. And so what you've got here is a sort of model of doing things that's about like a strategic objective, and then the deployment of products at, tactics at strategically useful moments along the way.
So is there anything specific that you're working on for the next 6 to 12 months?
So we're exploring what a second season of our Overshoot podcast could be, and how that could go beyond the storytelling that we've done so far. We're exploring the idea actually of maybe having one of our scenario exercises played through over a course of a few episodes. So there have been a number of content providers who in recent years have basically recorded war games of, say, confrontation between two nations, and it's a very gripping format and helps you understand some of the complexities of how we might respond to this world. So we're exploring that. We are going to do more of our own scenario exercises. We're at the moment developing one on what could happen if the major Atlantic circulation, this is the thing that means that Northwestern Europe is warmer than it otherwise would be, because it's at the same latitude as North America, Canada. And we're developing a scenario exercise for what could happen if that were to collapse, and how people could respond to that. And then we're also experimenting with a number of different, more traditional think tank products, briefings, for example, on some really important strategic things that are coming up. An example of this is that the world goes through El Niño and El Niño cycles. The El Niño cycle of that means that we get warmer. There is one coming up now, and that could be pretty severe, and it would feel like a sharp escalation in the lived experience of climate change. There's lots of information out there from scientists about what that could physically mean. We're exploring how we could do briefings on what that would mean for societies, and also the strategies of those who are trying to help us with climate change. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff lined up, and we're looking to expand the team over the next 18 months as well.
Nice. Are these war games exercise something that you do in person or digitally?
In person.
In person.
And it's the best way, yeah.
Okay, just out of curiosity, it's like the setting is like a small event, like 2-3 hours. How does it, or longer? How does it happen?
It can be that length. It can be longer, dependent on how much time participants have. Much shorter if they're more senior people. And very roughly, there are a bunch of like orientation elements to it, so people can sort of experience what's happening in this future that we've mapped out. And then we deploy a set of tools that focus basically on really hard decisions that you might have to make if this thing happened, decisions that you would never want to make. And then you work backwards to the present day to identify all the things that you could do so that you're not faced with that horrendous decision in the future. And we found that a very powerful mechanism for helping people explore a scenario and how they're going to respond today, what they can do today.
Cool. Perhaps maybe we can have a follow-up episode on these games that you guys organized.
So I had the absolute pleasure, if we're talking about games here, the absolute pleasure of working with some brilliant game designers, Matteo Medapace, and a few others, to develop a cooperative board game. I mean, they did development. We sort of helped advise them. A cooperative board game called Daybreak. So if anyone has played Pandemic, one of the top cooperative board games where you play through a global pandemic, right, developed by Matt Leacock. Well, similar designers and Matteo worked on a climate version. He had their role in advising that. And that is a brilliant simulation, basically, of a world that's being made increasingly unstable by climate change. And you're having to work together as different parts of the world to, on one hand, respond, like try and stop climate change, while also, on the other hand, having to handle the consequences. It's a very hard balance to get. It's a very hopeful game, beautifully designed. And if anyone wants to go check it out, just Google Daybreak game and grab a copy. We have no financial interest in it, of course, but we definitely have an intellectual and strategic interest in it, because it is a great simulator of these kind of dynamics and a great way to use gameplay when it comes to impact as well.
No, that's very good. Thanks a lot for the heads up. Obviously, we'll make also sure that the link to your podcast is there. Laurie, what's the best way for people who want to know more about things that you do to stay in contact or come into your ecosystem?
So go to scri.org.uk to check us out. You can drop us a line through there or sign up to our mailing list. And also follow me on social media. You can search for me, Laurie Laybourn, on LinkedIn and drop me a follow.
Perfect. And again, we'll make sure that all these links are in the show description. Well, Laurie, thanks a lot. It has been great to have you here, and I wish you a very good day.